Hayalperestlerin, risk alanların, denemekten korkmayanların cesaretinden doğduk. Bizi asla yarı yolda bırakmayan o sesin rehberliğiyle ilerlemeye ve öğrenmeye devam ediyoruz. Bunun için varız. Bu yüzden gece geç saatlere kadar lambalarımız sönmez. Elveda demek hem hüzün hem de gurur verir. Her şeyi sorgulayarak ve merakımızı besleyerek, dayanıklılığımızı test ederek, sınırlarımızı aşarak, ilerleyerek ve yeni ufuklar açarak yeni bir yol buluruz. Yeni icatlar çıkararak, kendi yolumuzu çizerek. Burası fikirlerin doğduğu ve yeni fikirleri doğurduğu, bizim de doğduğumuz, birlikte büyüdüğümüz ve yükseldiğimiz yer. Burası Yakın Doğu Üniversitesi.
Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to our seminar today entitled A Decade After the Arab Springs, Challenges and Prospects, organized by our Department of Political Science. Before we begin, I would like to express my thanks to Professor Dr. Nur Köprülü for the organization of today's events, and also I would like to express my gratitude to our guest speaker, Associate Professor Dr. Nadine Sika, for accepting our invitation and agreeing to be with us today. As we all know, the Arab Spring is a term that is used to describe the series of pro-democracy protests and uprisings that took place in the Middle East and North Africa, from Tunisia to Egypt, Yemen, and Bahrain. The events leading up to the Arab Spring began in 2010, and as a result, the region's political, society, and religion has changed. Today, Professor Nadine will be discussing the challenges and the prospects that the region is facing more than 10 years on. So it's obviously going to be very enlightening for us all. Therefore, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Professor Köprülü in order to introduce our guest speaker and start off our event for today. Thank you.
We would like to thank to our Dean, Professor Dr. Şerife Eyüboğlu, always supporting us in these kind of events and academic collaboration. I'm Nur Köprülü, and I would like to welcome you all, and it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you to our event entitled A Decade After the Arab Spring, Challenges and Prospects. As you all recall, one of the main questions that has resurfaced in the post-Arab uprisings era has been to what extent these protests and the popular calls for political opening would result in democratization in the Middle East and North Africa region. The uprisings have unlocked a new moment of political and youth activism in the entire region. And during and after the Arab uprisings, regimes did not travel similar trajectories in the region. And this is for this specific reason that we are here today with this seminar, with the aim of unpacking the changing political landscape in the region. And I would like to welcome our distinguished speaker from Cairo, Egypt, Associate Professor Dr. Nadine Sika. And let me very briefly introduce her to you all. Dr. Nadine Sika is an Associate Professor of Comparative Politics at the American University in Cairo. She was a Humboldt Foundation Visiting Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin between 2014 and 15. Before joining American University in Cairo, she was a guest scholar at the Political Science Institute at Tübingen University in Germany, and also a consultant to the UNDP, Regional Arab Office on Poverty and Good Governance. She is a member of the Board of Directors of Egyptian Institution for Public Opinion Polling, which is called BISIRA, and she is the book review editor of the Mediterranean Politics. And she is also the author of Youth Activism and Contentious Politics in Egypt, and also the co-author of the book entitled The Arab Uprisings, the Transforming and Challenging State Power. And there, Nadine, the floor is yours. And once again, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Professor Nur, for this kind invitation. I'm really happy to be here with you, and I want to extend my gratitude and thanks to everyone at the Near East University, and of course, the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. And thank you for welcoming me here. I'm really happy to be with you and to be discussing my thoughts on what has been happening in the Middle East and North Africa a decade after the uprisings. I will try to be as brief as possible so that we can open up the floor for further discussions and questions for everyone around. So without further ado, I will just add the presentation and we can start. Okay. So can everyone, is the screen available? I can't see anyone. Okay, so I guess I will start now. And first of all, I want us to discuss today what do we know about the MENA a decade after the Arab uprisings. So the presentation will be divided into a few parts. The first part, I will just have an introduction and an overview of the Arab uprisings. What were the socioeconomic and political grievances of Arab citizens prior to the 2010 and 2011 uprisings. And then I will discuss what scholars in the field of the Middle East and North Africa have been analyzing. And I will introduce this idea of post-democratization analysis. And then I will discuss where scholars are now on the Middle East and North Africa. What kind of analysis do we have on the Middle East after the uprisings? And one of the very important concepts that is being introduced today and discussed extensively is autocratization, which is the entrenchment of authoritarianism in the region a decade after the uprisings. And then at the end, I will discuss the socio-political and economic grievances of citizens today in the region and the impact on mobilization. So to start with, the Middle East and North Africa have long been characterized as regions where authoritarianism is entrenched. We have had regimes which have had dictators for over 40 years, for example, like in Libya and in Yemen. And analysis on those countries has always been about how and why do dictators hold on to power and how were they able to continue their power in the region. But then by 2010, we've seen a diffusion of demonstrations, which started off in Tunisia and traveled to the rest of the countries. And one of the major reasons for those diffusions is this feeling of citizens that if this happened in Tunisia, we have actually the same socioeconomic grievances, and that's why we're also going to be demonstrating against our dictators, and hence we have the fusion process and large-scale mobilizations in different countries, as Professor Köprülü was saying. And then we see that those large-scale mobilizations have led to different trajectories in the region, emanating from regime breakdown in countries like Egypt and Tunisia to large-scale mobilization, but no regime breakdown in countries like Bahrain, for instance. And then we've seen also that the demonstrations have traveled to other countries in the region, like Morocco, to monarchies in the region, like Morocco and Jordan, but those were very small-scale demonstrations and regime resilience ensued. So for us here is we want to understand what happened and why did some regimes face breakdown and others face democratization or autocratization. So that will be further for our analysis here. So to start to understand a little bit about the structural variables leading to the uprisings, most of the scholars and actually people who mobilized and went to the streets against Arab regimes were basically because of socioeconomic grievances, high unemployment levels, rising poverty levels, and increasing inequalities. And due to these, those structural grievances were very important for demonstrations and mobilizations in the region. Yet, during the same decade that all those grievances were prevalent, the international community, especially the international financial institutions, looked at the Middle East and saw that actually what Middle East regimes are doing was fine. We've had the structural adjustment programs to stop the employment problems and to increase education and healthcare systems, etc., etc. And we were also, countries in the region were trying to enlarge the private sector and add employment opportunities, especially for young people. And by 2010, for instance, the World Bank considered Egypt and Tunisia, especially Tunisia actually, as a poster child for structural readjustments and for development processes occurring in the developing world. But then again, there was a mismatch between what kind of economic structural changes were happening on the ground and how citizens perceived those structural changes in their daily lives. So obviously, the economic strategies were not helping citizens to develop further, were not helping the economic grievances, but actually they were putting more pressure on citizens at large. So during this decade, a lot of analysis on the Middle Lot looking at the Middle East as a region which has a lot of authoritarian regimes. Entrenched authoritarian regimes were there, and the analysis was in the so-called post-democratization analysis. And scholars have looked at the region as a region that's not going to democratize, and it's actually going to stay there. And some scholars like Albrecht and Schlumberger, for instance, said that the region is in transition to nowhere, meaning that we're staying there, authoritarian regimes are going to stay. And four major factors according to scholars, were attributed to the fact that that the region is exceptional in its authoritarian persistence. First thing was due to weak civil society and opposition parties. So within the political liberalization and economic liberalization processes, we've had civil society and opposition political parties, yet those were really weak and did not add to any democratization process. The region was also host to a very strong coercive institutions. The military, the police forces were on very high alert, and they would use a lot of force and repression against the citizens. The third thing is the existence of rentier and semi-rentier states, which can influence politics and policies without having in the region at large, without giving the conditionalities for good governance and democracy. So countries in the region would not really need to rely on institutions that would enforce good governance and democracy, but they can actually stay and receive money and help from rentier states, especially in the Gulf Cooperation Council. The fourth reason was that in the Middle East and North Africa, we've had a lot of internal and external wars, which permeate, again, the dependency on military for internal security. So the fourth and third factors are actually, the second and the fourth factors were actually very much interrelated. And according to scholars in the region, this is one of those four factors were one of the major reasons why we actually have authoritarianism in the region, and we're not going to go any further, even with the socioeconomic problems that the region was foreseeing. Now, the scholarly analysis from that point never anticipated the contentious activities or the mobilizational processes that were going to occur in the Middle East and North Africa. And scholars, even us here in the region, we never anticipated that that mobilization might actually lead to regime change or to regime breakdown. But then once the Arab uprisings occurred in Tunisia and they traveled to different countries, scholars and policymakers alike started to look differently at the region and started to say that, now we might have some kind of openings, and we need to understand and analyze why people started to mobilize from below. We need to understand what kind of civic and political engagements citizens are engaged in. and why are people really, why do they feel so aggressive against their own states? And then we have a plethora of analysis on contentious politics and social mobilization in the region. At this time, in 2010 and 2011, some scholars were actually very hopeful. And some scholars said that we need to just, think beyond authoritarian resilience in the region and move towards looking at the potential for democratization, because now we see that people are interested in political participation, and we see that there are different venues for participation. People are participating through different political parties, through civil society organizations, and they were actually able to mobilize large numbers of people to their cause. And actually in Egypt in particular, for example, from 2011 until 2013, there was a high number of new civil society organizations which erupted, youth organizations, new political parties which were really interested in democratization and advancing democracy and democratic values in the country. So that was the time when actually scholars were very hopeful that we can move towards a democratization process. But then a decade now, looking at what has been happening throughout the public sphere throughout the past decade, we see that unfortunately there are a lot of trends which lead us back to autocratization rather than towards democratization. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Middle East and North Africa in general, but so I'll just give you a brief outlook of where the regimes in the region are now. So we see that regimes which have foreseen breakdown, like Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen, we see different trajectories there. So in Tunisia, the first 2 years after the uprisings, we have seen a democratization process occurring with free and fair elections, with civil society organizations entering the public sphere, having an influence in politics, and really engaging in everyday life. But then with the elections of Qais Said in 2021, we see that there's a reversal in the autocratization, in the democratization process, and we see an autocratization process being entrenched there. In Egypt, we've seen some free and fair elections in 2012 and in 2011 actually, but then after 2012 we've seen a reversal towards authoritarianism with the events of 2013 and with the ouster of the Brotherhood from power. And then in Libya and Yemen, we've seen that those two countries have experienced civil wars and actually regime breakdown, which emanated in civil war. Here in the slides, I think I forgot to add Syria. Syria is an interesting case because in Syria, regime breakdown didn't occur. On the contrary, we have a regime that is still in power, but then the country itself went into civil war. And then by 2013 and then 2019 and 2021, we see another wave of uprisings. So in Turkey, we've seen demonstrations in 2013, but then Algeria, Sudan, Lebanon, and Iraq, and actually Iran have experienced the so-called 2.0 Arab uprisings, which have emerged by 2019. And those demonstrations have shown two trends. The first trend is that citizens are able to mobilize instantly, and people can mobilize because of socioeconomic grievances. So we see that in Lebanon, for example, and Iraq, socioeconomic grievances were at the heart of the demonstrations. But we also see that political issues are also very important when it comes to understanding mobilization and participation. So for example, in Algeria, the reason for demonstrations was actually political. Iraq as well, we've seen that political issues and the sectarian system is one of the major grievances of why people have demonstrated and went against the regime. Sudan, the same thing. So actually Sudan, we start as a socioeconomic grievances, which lead to political grievances. But here, when analyzing the region today, we need to put everything into perspective, not only socioeconomic reasons, but also we see that there's political reasons of why people demonstrate. Corruption, of course, the lack of political freedoms and the lack of political inclusion in the political process is one of the major reasons and grievances that people see. And when there's a political opportunity that opens for a mobilization to take place, people just use it and go to mobilize against the regime. So what can we understand about those dynamics and about what's happening in the region throughout those decades, with the fluctuations of demonstrations going up and down, contentious politics going up and down, and the entrenchment of certain regimes, civil wars, autocratization, democratization? What we see now is a new wave of autocratization. And by autocratization, what I see, what I define as autocratization is a deepening process of authoritarianism, which means that authoritarian structures, instead of moving towards a democratic process, they actually move towards an authoritarian process with more entrenched structures that lead to more authoritarianism. So the first trend that we see is that we find that there's a regime endurance in the Middle East under autocratic regimes, but this autocratization process is not actually tied to strong states, but it's rather tied to fragile and fierce states. So we see, for instance, this autocratization process happening in Egypt or in Syria, which is still under civil war, yet having an authoritarian structure re-entrenched. We see that this is happening in a state that is actually very fragile. It doesn't have strong institutions, but it is extremely fierce, meaning that it has no problem using force against its own citizens or repressing its own citizens. The second trend we see is that there's an increase in the use of repressive strategies in the region. And the repressive strategies are twofold. The first is targeted repression, meaning that there's a targeting of political activists and political opposition, but then there's also diffuse types of repression, which is the second type of repression, which means that the regimes, like the first trend, have no problem of using force against anyone on the street, against any citizen. And the targeted type of repression we see in authoritarian regimes which have not broken down during the 2011 uprisings. So we see that, for instance, in the GCC or in Morocco and Jordan, there's a large-scale targeted repression against opposition activists, but then the population is not being repressed against unless mass mobilization occurs. But then, on the other hand, we see in countries like in Egypt, for instance, which is a republic and which has seen breakdown, we see that there's a diffusion of repression against everyone, against not only political opposition, but against citizens on the streets as well. The third trend that we're seeing is that there's there's a support for authoritarian regimes by regional and international actors. And by actors here, it doesn't necessarily have to be state actors. It could also be non-state actors. So we see that organizations or movements like Hezbollah, for example, they help out regimes and they use extensive force and interventions in countries to support or uphold an authoritarian regime that was there, like the instance of Syria, for example. The fourth trend, which is a very interesting trend, is the role of the economy. And in the region, what we've seen is that the economy, or opening up the economic system, actually entrenches autocracy and leads to an autocratization process through two ways. The first thing is either through the economic elite being tied through a clientelist relation or a patron-client relation with the authoritarian regime, or we see an upsurge in the involvement of the regime in the economy. And both types of interventions, they actually lead to autocratization or are helpful for autocratization. By this, I would like to conclude by giving you this overview. I'd like to conclude on a few notes or a few conclusions. The first is, of course, state-society relations are and will remain contentious throughout the coming decade as well, given the socioeconomic and political grievances that citizens have, especially with the increased socioeconomic problems due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the Ukrainian crisis. But while the crises are increasing, civil society initiatives and activism are also on the rise. So we see that there's a structural problem, or the authoritarian regimes impose restrictions on civil society and opposition activism, yet civil society activists are able to move beyond those restrictions and develop new activist strategies, new initiatives, new organizations. And through those new initiatives, we see that they are able to have small contentious events, and they can really have some policy concessions out of those abrupt political activism. So, for example, we see in Jordan, for instance, in 2018, the regime was able to concede. The regime conceded to a lot of claims by civil society actors, especially for the teachers' unions, because of those small type, or the issue-oriented activism that's going on. And the last thing is whether is actually a question to everyone here, is whether we're on a road to democratization. I know I showed more of a road to autocratization, but then with civil society initiatives and activism, perhaps we can find ourselves in some sort of hybridism, where we have some democratization processes occurring, yet other autocratization processes occurring at the same time. And with this, I'd like to end my presentation, and hopefully we can open the floor for discussions. Nur, I'm very sorry, I can't hear you actually.
Okay, let me try again. Thank you very much, Nadine, for this comprehensive presentation. Let me to tell you that while you were speaking, actually, I was thinking that it was like, you did a very good job summarizing actually our democratization in the Middle East course this semester. And my master's students, I can also see them that they found it very insightful. They are following your discussion. Thank you very much. And they all also have different country cases this semester to present in the classroom. I'm very sure that your insightful points will definitely contribute to their academic formation. Before I move on to the, let's say, students' questions, I would like to actually ask you to clarify, maybe to go into detail about this. You mentioned about the two basic paradigms understanding democratization in the region: authoritarian persistence or resilience paradigm, and also post-democratization paradigm that actually dominated. And previously we have democratization paradigm, of course, no need to, forget it. But it seems like that with 2011 onwards, we academics, we also found it very difficult to analyze actually what's going on the ground. And don't you think also that all these paradigms sometimes are not very much adequate to have an in-depth analysis? And do you think that we need also further theoretical approaches regarding the Middle East studies, particularly in this subject?
Certainly, Nur. I think that this is a very important and pertinent problem, right? Because post-democratization studies emerged. That one of the major case studies was the Middle East to analyze post-democratization studies. And it was with this Albrecht and Schlumberger's seminal article, which says that we're not transitioning to anywhere. So we really need to discuss things differently. And I think one of the major problems with this post-democratization paradigm is that we have been stuck with the structural and institutional analysis much more than looking at what's happening from below, right? So it was basically an analysis of politics from above. What kind of institutions, how do the states use repression, or how is religion used against certain, I mean, you know, the discourse of religion used to uphold authoritarianism, etc., etc. But there was a certain lack of understanding what's happening from below. So politics from below was totally ignored, except for very, very few studies which looked at political participation. And yet again, looking at political participation from the perspective of, okay, so people are participating to entrench autocracy. And of course, one of the major scholars contributing to that was Ellen Lust-Oker, who looked at participation in participating in elections, and because we participate in elections, we're entrenching authoritarian regimes as well. So I think that with the Arab uprising in 2011, it was a really wake-up call that we need to look beyond these things to look at, you know, the agency of people, and how do people, what's the agentic power of people to actually change. And this was so from 2011 until 2018, I was trying to build in this literature a little bit, and this is where my book on youth activism comes in. And I have a new book coming out on youth in Egypt again in early next year. And here I was only looking at what's happening from below. What do young people see? And where do they think they stand vis-a-vis the regime? And how are they engaging through different venues and different parts? So a lot of what came out from the field work with activists in Egypt and in the Middle East and North Africa in general was that they really believe in participation for change. But what kind of change, right? Because there's only so much you can do within a structure that's entrenching more authoritarianism, right? So we see, so through analyzing a little bit about, you know, the era from 2011 until 2013 in Egypt, you see that there's a surge in political activism and political participation because the structure was open and it was okay for people to participate. But then afterwards, everything, the structure closed down, right? And repression increased, and hence, because repression increased, participation took different trends. So it's not participating for a democracy promotion, but actually participating for change. And what kind of change? So change for, if you do a little bit of field work, for instance, with activists or with people who participate, they tell you, we want change, but we don't really care about democracy, which was not the case in 2013, right? So if you look at survey analysis in 2013, especially young people were so interested in having democracy. And now in 2019, in 2020, I was involved in one of the survey studies on youth in the MENA region. And there was a big change where young people now are more interested in having a strong person in power rather than democracy. And this again plays out because the structure is changing. So I think that moving beyond those theoretical frameworks, we need to always have this holistic and, you know, dynamic framework where we put together the structure and the agency and move beyond only looking at autocratization or democratization. I think we can this dynamic thing can come and it can be analyzed, and it could definitely be done so through people working on the region, because the region is so full of, you know, changes and dynamism that's happening.
Well, actually, thank you very much for this input, because you also reminded us once again that in 2022 as well, the Arab Barometer also showed that most of the people in the region started to think about that democracy is not a panacea for everything. And first of all, the employment, because their main point is still economic recessions and unemployment. Nadine, we have a question from Professor Monsef Kadar. Let me read his question. The periodization often used needs to be revised in light of what happened, for instance, in 2013 in Egypt and 2021 in Tunisia. I also thank you for your presentation, Professor Monsef is saying. Thank you, Hojam. Yes, Nadina.
I'm afraid, Nur, I'm not very clear on the question. So, what does Professor Khaddar mean by the periodization?
As far as I understood, but he can also use the chat button to elaborate his question. But it seems like that, you know, we basically start with 2011 or 2010 with the first protests in Tunisia, but later in 2011, the overall region engulfed by the Arab uprisings, more or less. But I think he would like to give us that there is also another trajectory, which is probably the overthrow of Morsi in Egypt in 2013, and also in 2021 when there were things, let's say, started to change in the case of Tunisia.
So I
probably he just wanted to highlight this.
Okay. So yes, definitely, very important. And I think the first 2 years after the uprisings, everyone was in state of limbo. The regimes and the citizens, right? People didn't know what's going to happen, and the regimes themselves also they had to use different strategies of autocratization and different strategies of rebuilding their own regimes. And then we saw also a lot of counter-revolutionary regimes trying to help out regimes that would be friendly and helpful. And within this, here comes the dynamic that I was talking about the relationship between the regional and international dimension with what's happening in the countries that have foreseen large mobilization processes. So we can see, I think that everything is really interlinked. The rise in repression, the rise of influence of other Arab regimes or regional powers in the regimes themselves are important. So I think it's easy for us to make the distinction of the periods 2011, 13, 21. But I think that it's also, as you, Nur, were saying, it's a big process, and you can't really see change as abruptly coming. Yes, 2011 was a critical juncture, of course, because we've seen the extent to which citizens are able to mobilize and are able to be influenced from other regimes in the or from other people in the region. But then there's a continuation process of give and take, democratization, autocratization. So it's really dynamic and it's really changing.
Thank you, Nadine. And Professor Khaddar is also saying that it was just a comment, not a question. And then actually, he also wanted to highlight what you already said, that changes after 2013 or 2021 are as important than the past 2010, for instance, for the case of Tunisia. We have also a question from one of our master's students. With the authoritarian persistence in the region, what does the future hold for democratization in the MENA region as a whole? Probably his name is Musa. Musa would like to hear maybe some positive maybe scenarios if we would have.
Yes. Okay, Musa, I really would have loved to give some positive outlooks. I mean, if we had this discussion in 2012, I would have been very, very optimistic and positive, and I would have told you about all the structural things and the agentic power of young people and of civil society actors in change. But what I see, and again, we don't have to, with all the criticism of academia, that we only look at either autocracy or democracy. Of course, if we look at it from those nodes, autocracy versus democracy, I'm sure autocracy would win. But then if we look at it from a fluid perspective, from fact that institutional changes are happening and people are becoming more included in the political process, then it might be more optimistic. But from an structural institutionalist perspective and the regional and international dynamics, unfortunately, what I see is an autocratization or a deepening of the authoritarian regimes. And it's not because the Middle East is exceptional, as scholars have tended to say in general, but it's actually because there's a global phenomenon of autocratization. I don't know if you're familiar with what's happening elsewhere in the world. But also scholars today are analyzing the autocratization process that's happening in other countries and in other post-Soviet republics and China and in Asia, and how this is a phenomenon that is very important to analyze. And also de-democratization is occurring in countries that have seen democracy for a very long time, like in Eastern Europe and in Latin America as well. So it's not, I don't want us to look at the Middle East as an exceptional area. We see it as a case study of autocratization, but the global phenomenon of autocratization is really taking over the trend today with different, with the rise of populism, with the rise of different leaders, etc. So it's part of a global phenomenon.
Thank you, Nadine, for also referring to this in general. I mean, it's a global context, actually, we need to take into consideration as well. Dauda, another student from the master's program, is asking my concern about the case of Lebanon. Well, actually, there was something actually in my mind as well to ask about Lebanon, because it is one of the cases that can be also, mainly illustrated a case for seeing sectarianism. What would you like to say for the future of Lebanon, at least in today's conjuncture?
Yes, I think actually, although the world looks at Lebanon from a very dim perspective, that it's because of the socioeconomic problems, of course, and the monetary crisis that they're seeing. But on a note of freedoms and participation, I think that Lebanon has the highest scale of citizen participation in politics. And I think that the trend of de-sectarianization is growing more and more. The independents have won a lot of seats in the parliament. At least they can voice their opinions. They can add to changes, to policy changes and legal changes, which was not even imaginable in 2012. So with the 2015 Youth Think movement and the ensuing changes which the activist movements have done since that time, we've seen a strong base for a trend, especially by young people and leftist movements, to ensure that or to add to they have shown that they dislike the sectarian system and they want to have an alternative view of politics. So this is becoming more and more evident in the case of Lebanon, and it's also happening in Iraq with a lot of demonstrations, a lot of contentious activities against the sectarian system. So I think that from that perspective, of course, this is very important and necessary for changing the political system. The other side of the story is that the sectarian elites, they don't want to change that, because this is the way that they are gaining their own power. Without the sectarian system, the sectarian elite wouldn't have power in the polity, and this is not what they want, right? They want to have their own, they want to increase and entrench their own power in society, even if this is against having a strong state. So they prefer having a strong sectarian system rather than a strong Lebanese state. But what the new generation, or at least the new activist generation is pointing out and is actually playing out in politics, is saying that the sectarian system is no longer serving the interests of the people, and that's why we need change. So even if this change is incremental, I think with all the economic problems that are happening in Lebanon, the opposition and the independents have a lot of voice and a lot of power in Lebanon, especially that there's not as much repression in Lebanon as much as there is in other countries in the region.
Dear Nadine, we are actually approaching to the end of our session, but there is also a comment, also a question, the support in terms of internal economic elites for what is called autocratization, maybe any case from Tunisia or Egypt. How would you like to take this question?
Certainly. So we see that this was very clear prior to the uprisings. That there was a marriage between business people and the political elite in Egypt, for instance. There was a lot of corruption in Tunisia as well, where the political elite and the economic elite have been also very tightly knit. I mean, you know, so in Egypt, for instance, Gamal Mubarak, the son of Hosni Mubarak, was very influential in the economy, and he had a lot of interlinks with the business elite. Same thing with Ben Ali. His wife's brother was his wife actually, and his wife's brother were amongst the richest in the country. This trend changed, at least in the case of Egypt, which I'm very well aware of. The economy changed from a clientelistic relationship of a lot of business people to a fewer business people, and an entrenchment of the military in the economy. And this is increasing the power of the regime, right? Because the regime is tightly knit with the military. And because it's tightly knit with the military, they're also increasing their influence in the economy. So having so much influence in the economy and in the political sphere, autocratization is being entrenched, right? Because there's no way, or at least it's very hard to take out military establishments from the economy in Egypt today, because this would add stress to the economy. So that's how both are engaged together.
Thank you very much, Nadine. And there are so many things actually that we need to talk about. But I would like to, on behalf of our faculty, our university, and also on behalf of our students, I would like to thank you very much for this, very comprehensive and also stimulating debate. And discussing actually these topics are really important, particularly if we are studying this region. And as you also said, this is not something peculiar to Middle East and North Africa. And it is actually needs to be discussed at the global level. And as one of our students also comment, which is democracy is something really, really fragile. And we need to also bring always this into consideration. I try my best actually to share the certificate of appreciation for you, which has been prepared by our university. And let me once again thank you very much on behalf of our Dean, Professor Dr. Şerife Eyüboğlu, our university and our department for this contribution. Believe me, the students, they also read your articles, some of your articles, and it is absolutely amazing, fantastic to have you online in our course and in our university. Thank you very much, Nadine. Shukran jazilan.
Thank you, Nur. Thank you very much for having me. It was a great pleasure. I wish I had more time to discuss more things, and hopefully in the future we will be in contact. And if any of your students or faculty would be interested in having an open dialogue with us here at AUC, I would love to have this. And perhaps we can have one time a class, because next semester I'm also teaching democratization and regime change. So perhaps we can have a dual class. Your university, my university, I'll be in touch with you to do that. And I'm really happy to have had the chance to discuss these things with you and to put my thoughts into writing. I haven't done that in a while, so it's always refreshing to do that. And I hope we...
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hopefully maybe next year, 2023, we can also host you here in Uniersity University. You are always welcome to Cyprus.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nur. Thank you. And thank you to the Dean and to the university and everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We would like to also inform our students that there will be actually a video which is going to give you some details about information about e-study box. Do not, don't leave the session.
Thank you for having me. As e-study box, I'm always very happy to join in with the webinars. Ms. Nadine, Ms. Nur, such an amazing, and like you said, simulating webinar for all. If you would like to have a participant certificate for this webinar, please go into e-study box, which I will show you how to register now. When you open up e-studybox.com, sign in using your name that you would like to have on your certificate, going in and typing and finding this webinar and applying for your certificate. Among other 2,000 educational videos that we have, please have a look through to find something of your interest. New Year's is coming up. A lot of discounts will be available. Please stay in touch and also be aware of our services that we supply as translation, proofreading, and data analysis, which you can also get from here. But first, register in. Thank you, Ms. Nur. Thank you, Ms. Nadine. And also, Şerife Hocam, thank you very much. Have a lovely day.
Hayalperestlerin, risk alanların, denemekten korkmayanların cesaretinden doğduk. Bizi asla yarı yolda bırakmayan o sesin rehberliğiyle ilerlemeye ve öğrenmeye devam ediyoruz. Bunun için varız. Bu yüzden gece geç saatlere kadar lambalarımız sönmez. Elveda demek hem hüzün hem de gurur verir. Her şeyi sorgulayarak ve merakımızı besleyerek, dayanıklılığımızı test ederek, sınırlarımızı aşarak, ilerleyerek ve yeni ufuklar açarak yeni bir yol buluruz. Yeni icatlar çıkararak, kendi yolumuzu çizerek. Burası fikirlerin doğduğu ve yeni fikirleri doğurduğu, bizim de doğduğumuz, birlikte büyüdüğümüz ve yükseldiğimiz yer. Burası Yakın Doğu Üniversitesi.